Imagine stepping out onto the street of a massive, hyper-advanced metropolis. You look up, feeling drops of moisture hit your face. But it's not rain. There are no clouds anymore.
Right.
Instead, you're standing under this permanent, suffocating overcast of processing heat rising from endless underground server farms. What's falling on you is condensation, thick with salt and particulate matter blown out of these massive industrial cooling systems. The street priests who live down here in the lower levels, they actually call it the tiers of infrastructure.
It is a, well, a profoundly visceral establishing image.
Yeah.
You can practically taste the ozone and the grit,
Yeah.
It completely grounds the high concept theories we're going to explore today in a physical reality.
Welcome, learner, to the deep dive. Today we're looking at a brilliant and honestly unsettling manuscript by Max and Claude titled The Preferential Option for the Crashed. This narrative sits at this incredibly tense intersection of cyberpunk science fiction, hard systems engineering, and radical theology.
It's a fascinating mix.
It really is. Our mission for this deep dive is to explore the load-bearing flaws in the systems we build and what it actually takes to dismantle them.
And we're guided through this exploration by a protagonist named Matt Zhao, though he goes by Father Matthias. Matthias was once the text calls him a middleware priest in the shining upper rings of a city called Neo-Antioch.
A middleware priest. I love that term.
Right. His role was fascinating, essentially blessing data transactions. He was tasked with reconciling Christian charity with computational efficiency, and he lived comfortably at the top of the hierarchy until he experienced digital death.
Digital erasure. He was entirely wiped from the system because he made the mistake of asking a single question during a committee meeting. He looked at their perfectly optimized, beautiful network architecture and asked, who is left out of this model?
And the central governing algorithms just could not process that question because the answer wasn't a glitch to be patched. The answer was structural. As a result, Matthias is stripped of his identity validations and exiled to Substrate 7, a degraded lower zone constructed from hollowed-out, obsolete server cells.
Just tossed out completely.
Exactly. Down there, he opens a clinic for the people the city legally designates as the unvalidated. But on the street, they're just known as the crashed.
We should probably define what being crashed means in this specific architecture. In Neo-Antioch, everything from your currency to your physical location to your biological augmentations, it all requires constant digital validation from the central mainframe.
Yeah, every single second.
So being crashed means your identity tokens have been corrupted or your access has been entirely revoked. You are effectively erased from the operational reality of the city.
And the physical toll of this erasure is severe, which Matthias witnesses firsthand when a patient named Sophia is brought into his clinic.
Oh man, Sophia's condition is horrifying, but it illustrates the mechanics of this world so perfectly. She's brought into Matthias's clinic, which is essentially like a 12 by 12 closet with exposed fiber optic cables. And she looks like malfunctioning hardware.
It's so disturbing to read.
The detail that really stands out is her eyes. Her eyes are moving at different speeds. Her pupils are dilating and contracting entirely out of sync with the ambient light in the room.
Right, so we are looking at a phenomenon the authors call neural drift. Her visual cortex has been completely severed from the constant identity-confirming data feeds of the upper rings.
Because in a hypernetwork biology, the brain relies on a continuous heartbeat protocol from the central server, right, to maintain sensory synchronization.
Precisely. Because she was unplugged, those neural synchronization patterns are literally drifting apart. She is physically fragmenting.
And she was unplugged because she was investigating the transaction logs, trying to find a pattern to determine exactly who gets crashed and why. And through her research, the massive revelation of this narrative drops.
Yes, the big reveal.
The system of Neo-Antioch, with all its horrific inequality and suffering, is not failing. It is working exactly as its architects intended.
The upper rings enjoy a 7-layer redundancy protocol. If a processor fails, a backup activates in microseconds. In the middle rings, the latency is noticeable, but you maintain your baseline connectivity as long as your productivity metrics remain high. But in the substrate zones, the infrastructure is deliberately degraded.
I do struggle a bit with Matthias's framing of this as inherent malice, though. If we look at real-world network architecture, QoS quality of service algorithms are standard practice.
That's a fair point.
If you have finite bandwidth and finite compute power, the system absolutely must prioritize certain packets over others. Dropping the lowest priority data packets during peak load isn't necessarily cruelty, it's just network survival, like a body needing a place for waste.
Right, but the horror here is that the waste is human beings.
Exactly. If the central allocation hypervisor doesn't enforce a hierarchy, the whole grid crashes. So isn't Matthias kind of conflating a hard mathematical limit with an ethical feeling?
Well, what's fascinating here is that that is the exact defense used by the architects of Neo-Antioch, and Matthias spends a significant portion of his manuscript deconstructing it. He realizes the system's designers weren't cartoon villains. They were economists and engineers solving optimization equations.
Making hard choices.
Exactly. But to justify dropping those specific packets, which, as you said, represent human lives, they constructed a theology of merit. They encoded the belief that if you crash, you are inherently unreliable. Your metrics were poor.
So they masked a structural necessity behind a moral judgment.
Yes, the system is framed as a neutral arbiter of physics, while the guilt and the blame are placed entirely on the individual. Matthias identifies this as hamartia. In Greek theater, it means a tragic flaw, but here Matthias applies it to the network.
It's a fatal load-bearing flaw built into the foundation of the code.
The tragedy is that the optimization algorithm literally cannot run without defining a bottom tier, a place for the digital waste to go. The theology of merit prevents the people in the substrate from realizing their suffering is artificial, because they realized it was artificial, they might overthrow it.
Right, and once Matthias and Sophia uncover that the scarcity in substrate 7 is manufactured just to maintain the hierarchy, they reach a breaking point. Doing nothing becomes an act of complicity.
It absolutely does.
This leads Matthias to revive a concept from ancient theological archives, the preferential option for the crashed.
It is a radical heuristic for systems engineering. The preferential option dictates that any system design, any routing algorithm, and any resource allocation must be evaluated first and foremost by its impact on the most systematically disadvantaged user.
Okay, so flipping the priority upside down.
Completely. If a network requires the exclusion of a specific demographic to achieve its efficiency, then the baseline structure of justice requires dismantling that efficiency to side with the excluded.
And theory eventually demands action. We're introduced to two critical new figures. Jonas, an older resident of the substrate who crashed decades ago, and David, a systems engineer who actually managed to smuggle out the source code of the crash algorithm.
They traced the logic gates and confirmed that surplus compute could easily be routed to the substrate, but it is artificially throttled. So their solution is to write a patch.
They engineer a temporary bypass, a patch designed to force the substrate zones to run on the exact same infrastructure standards as the middle rings, effectively nullifying the artificial scarcity.
Yes.
But I have a major technical issue with their strategy here. David the engineer explicitly notes that the lower rings are heavily integrated into the city's central nervous system. Injecting unverified routing tables into a hyper-optimized mainframe is begging for a broadcast storm.
It's incredibly risky.
Matthias is risking a cascading failure that could shut down life support systems across the entire city grid, just to prove a philosophical point. Furthermore, David admits the central allocation hypervisor will detect and annihilate this patch almost immediately. If they know the fix is temporary and highly dangerous, why do it? Aren't they just poking a bear for no reason?
The strategic value isn't stability, though. The value is consciousness. Jonas makes the compelling argument that the current cruelty of Neo-Antioch is entirely algorithmic. It runs on autopilot.
The machine just does the dirty work.
Exactly. The administrators at the very top of the spire never have to look at the consequences of their optimization. By injecting this patch, they force a critical error flag at the highest administrative level.
Oh, wait. They are triggering a manual override?
Precisely. The highest level administrators will be forced to look at the code. They will see that resources have been deliberately reallocated to keep people alive in the substrate. To remove the patch, those administrators cannot rely on the passive, automated algorithms. They will have to consciously choose to hit the kill switch and plunge those people back into darkness.
They are forcing the system to transition from unconscious, automated efficiency to deliberate conscious cruelty. And the execution of this plan is deeply moving. Disguised within a routine maintenance checksum, the patch goes live.
It's a beautiful moment in the text.
For exactly 48 hours, Substrate 7 experiences adequate network connectivity. Data moves without being corrupted. Packets are delivered without being dropped. Sophia, the patient suffering from neural drift, breaks down in tears. She is weeping simply because she can witness information flowing freely without being destroyed.
It is a brief, intense taste of grace. But the mechanics of the system are ruthless. On the 49th hour, the central hypervisor flags the anomaly. The administrators panic at the loss of control, pull the patch, and the artificial scarcity rushes back into the vacuum. The substrate goes completely dark again.
And forcing a monolithic system into consciousness comes with severe retaliatory consequences. Matthias's clinic is raided by the authorities, his network is dismantled, and the core group is arrested. We then move to the interrogation room.
And this interrogation sequence fundamentally subverts the tropes of the genre.
It really does. You expect Matthias to be thrown into a dark, damp cell, beaten by anonymous guards. But the reality is far more insidious. The interrogation room is meticulously climate controlled.
Yes, such a great detail.
In a city like Neo-Antioch, where thermal regulation requires massive amounts of processing power and energy, pumping cold air into a single room is a massive flex of infrastructural dominance. It is the system communicating. We possess absolute control. Brute force is beneath us.
And his interrogator, Sarah Chen, is equally subversive. She is not a religious zealot of the system's theology. She is a highly pragmatic intelligence analyst. She looks at the data and recognizes instantly the catastrophe Matthias has triggered.
What does she tell him?
She tells him, "You forced the system into consciousness. Every resource allocation now requires explicit human choice." She understands that Matthias has rendered the system catastrophically unstable because utilizing visible, conscious force to maintain inequality is incredibly expensive and politically volatile.
Here's where it gets really interesting, learner, because the system's countermove is brilliant in its seduction. They realize that making Matthias a martyr would only validate his theology. Instead, they offer him a comfortable, incremental compromise.
They don't just torture them.
Right. Sarah Chen proposes allocating slightly better resources to the substrate. They offer to make the exclusion a little less cruel. All Matthias has to do is agree to stop injecting disruptive patches, accept a position as a theological consultant for the upper rings, and help them manage the inequality politely.
And David, the engineer who wrote the patch, he actually takes the deal. He agrees to integrate back into the system.
Wait, really? He just sells out?
Oh, if you are David, the utilitarian logic of taking the deal is overwhelming. Incremental progress shifts the parameters. You get inside the firewall, you optimize the resource allocation by 5%, and you tangibly save lives in the substrate. Rejecting that to rot in a cell seems almost arrogant.
But Matthias rejects it entirely. He terms this refusal, the interrogation, as sacrament. If he accepts the deal, he is validating the foundational premise of the system, that the administrators possess the moral authority to distribute crumbs of survival.
Right.
Accepting a nicer oppression permanently kills the possibility of genuine structural change. Matthias chooses to remain in prison, operating under the theory that forcing the system to rely on visible, continuous repression will eventually cause the architecture to fracture.
He chooses the role of the uncompromising witness. But the narrative introduces a fascinating duality through a smuggled letter from David. David did collaborate. He did help implement the soft repression, but while he had administrative access to the central code repository, he engaged in subterfuge.
Oh, the back doors.
Yes, he didn't just optimize, he built backdoors. The text describes David turning the original patch into a distributed, decentralized prayer embedded deep within the city's operating system.
I need to unpack the mechanics of a decentralized prayer. That sounds incredibly poetic, but functionally, how does a rogue patch survive in a tightly monitored mainframe? If the hypervisor killed the 48-hour patch instantly, why does this one survive?
Because it is no longer a monolithic injection of code. David weaponized the incremental progress he was hired to build. He wrote polymorphic code, algorithms that constantly change their identifiable signatures.
Oh, that's clever.
He hid these subroutines within a massive routine checksums of the city's daily operations. It operates like a benign botnet sitting on the edge nodes of the network. It doesn't attempt a massive citywide reallocation. Instead, it lies dormant, self-replicating, and occasionally forcing a micro-reallocation of resources in the substrate before slipping back into the background noise.
So it's an ongoing, distributed refusal to accept the finality of the system. We have Matthias providing the rigid, unyielding theological anchor from his prison cell, and David providing the compromised, messy, practical engineering from inside the machine.
Exactly. The narrative suggests that dismantling a load-bearing flaw requires both methodologies. Over the course of several years, this distributed prayer of constant, decentralized micropatches begins to erode the foundation of Neo-Antioch.
But the collapse is not a cinematic explosion, right?
No, not at all. Systems designed around hyper-efficiency do not explode, they degrade.
A processing node goes offline, and the backup protocols fail to initiate because the routing tables have been subtly patched too many times. The optimization algorithms begin to hallucinate because the data feeds they rely on are constantly being modified by underground engineers operating on the edge nodes.
It's death by 1,000 cuts.
The central mainframe begins experiencing contradiction and ambiguity. I mean, human beings navigate contradiction every single day, but a highly optimized algorithm simply cannot process it. The system just chokes on its own rigidity.
And amidst this slow, cascading degradation, Matthias is released. He isn't pardoned. He is released into the border zones between the upper and lower rings because the central authority is losing its grip. He seeks out Sophia, who is now helping coordinate these newly formed autonomous zones where the centralized mainframe has entirely failed.
In its place, the people of the substrate have built their own decentralized networks. Sophia reveals that the remaining authorities in the upper rings are terrified. They cannot recreate the old hierarchy because Davis patches are too deeply embedded in the firmware.
They're desperate.
Yeah, they are desperately offering massive concessions like political representation, dedicated server farms, begging the autonomous zones to integrate back into a centralized authority, and Sophia refuses. They aren't interested in replacing the old boss with a new boss. They are replacing a machine with a garden.
We really need to dig deeply into this machine versus garden metaphor because it perfectly encapsulates the shift in systems architecture.
So what does this all mean? A centralized mainframe, the machine of Neo-Antioch, is incredibly fast and highly predictable, but it is ultimately brittle. It represents a single point of failure. If you sever a primary connection in a machine, the operation halts.
Right.
The autonomous zones are building what they call a networked commons, which operates like a garden, or more accurately, a mesh network. A mesh network is messy. It has weeds. The routing paths are chaotic. It is wildly inefficient compared to a mainframe.
But that inefficiency is its armor. If a node goes down in a mesh network, the data doesn't stop. It organically finds a new, albeit slower, route path to its destination. Sophia refers to this as the redundancy principle. They are intentionally building inefficiency into the architecture of the new society.
That seems counterintuitive until you analyze the scale. Efficiency at the massive scale of centralized control always requires oppression. It requires a load-bearing flaw where someone's needs are categorized as acceptable loss. By choosing a less efficient, decentralized model, they are distributing knowledge and decision-making power directly to the edge nodes.
To the people who are actually affected by the outcomes. Even Sarah Chen, the intelligence analyst who initially offered Matthias the compromise, recognizes the paradigm shift. She meets with Matthias one last time in the border zones.
Oh, wow. What happens there?
She looks entirely depleted by the psychological burden of trying to manage a failing conscious system.
Yeah.
She realizes she cannot stop the degradation, and she cannot force the network back into its old, unconscious state. She accepts the collapse.
Matthias suggests to her that perhaps her role is no longer to manage or to save, but simply to grieve what is lost and witness what is being built. To stand in the ambiguous space between paradigms. It is a profound character arc, a former operative of the oppressor transitioning into a witness of the new ecology.
This brings us to the culmination of Matthias's manuscript. The upper rings have fractured, the networked commons is growing in the substrate, and Matthias finally concludes his writing. If this were a standard narrative, it would end with a utopian vision of a flawless society. But Matthias is far too disciplined for utopia.
He writes a theology of perpetual reformation. The new mesh networks they have built are not perfect. Because they are human systems, they are already beginning to breed their own subtle inequalities and new informal hierarchies. But Matthias argues that the goal was never to build a flawless city. The true victory wasn't building a flawless city, but giving the crashed their agency back. The patch wasn't a one-time software update that solved human nature. The patch is an ongoing, infinite practice. It is the daily, continuous refusal to accept whatever the current baseline of injustice happens to be.
Human flourishing is not a mathematical equation to be solved and permanently archived. It is a condition that requires continuous tending. Any system, regardless of its original benevolent intentions, will eventually ossify. It will optimize itself and, in doing so, create a new margin of excluded people.
The waste.
Exactly. The preferential option for the crashed is a mandate to continuously scan the horizon, identify who is currently being pushed to the outside of the model, and begin writing new patches.
It is a phenomenal framework for analyzing the architectures we inhabit. And as we conclude this deep dive, learner, I want to bring these concepts out of the realm of cyberpunk theology and directly into your reality. Think about the systems you rely on every day.
The ones we take for granted.
Exactly. We all operate within complex systems. We navigate corporate hierarchies, we rely on supply chain algorithms, we interact with bureaucratic local governments, and we are fed information by opaque social networks.
It is incredibly easy to accept the narrative that these systems are neutral forces of nature. When we see people falling through the cracks of these structures, it is far more comfortable to believe the theology of merit, to assume they lack the necessary metrics, rather than facing the terrifying reality that the system might require their exclusion to maintain its efficiency.
If every highly optimized system eventually requires someone or something to serve as the structural waste, wait, what does your own personal patch look like?
If forcing a system into consciousness is the necessary first step toward taking responsibility for its outcomes, what is a structural flaw in your own world that you are currently pretending not to see? And what would it cost you to force this system to acknowledge it?
Because sometimes, learner, the only way to stop the tiers of infrastructure from falling is to look up and finally ask, who is left out of this model?